fill this void.
Hello and welcome everyone to the Robert F. Kidd Library and the 19th annual Trillium reading. And welcome to all of you out there watching this via our GSU YouTube feed. I should thank Chris Cosner from our Fine Art Department and Dustin Crutchfield, our PR director over there behind the camera, for setting that up. Thank you very much. For those of you who don't know me, although I think that is all of you, I think you all do know me, I'm Jonathan Minton. I'm the faculty advisor for the Trillium for these past 15 years. The Trillium, of course, is the literary and arts publication of GSU. This event is being sponsored by the Little Kanawha Reading Series, so I want to give a quick shout out to that. That's a collaboration between the Department of Language and Literature, the Department of Social Science and its Appalachian Studies program, in the RFK Library. Its mission is to provide a showcase for a diversity of literary forms and voices in order to acknowledge and enrich the cultural heritage of Appalachia and the communities around the Little Kanawha River. And we are certainly fulfilling that mission with tonight's reading and celebration of the Trillium. Before we begin, I would like to thank our student editors for curating and putting this issue together, our literary editor, Anna Childers, and our art editor, Zoe Yates. They did a wonderful job. And of course, I'd like to thank our Trillium contributors, some of whom are in the audience and will be reading later. Thank you. You guys rock. You're amazing. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our special guest reader, Tara Wine Queen. Tara is a graduate from GSU's English education program. She's had a brilliant career as an English teacher at the Robert Bland Middle School in Weston. She's now devoting herself to being a full-time writer. Her publications include Tenderness in Troubling Times, which is amazing. I love it. It's available at Amazon. Get a copy. It's a terrific work. We were just having a conversation about how your first work, sometimes you kind of leave it behind and go on to new things, but it's still worth picking up. It's an amazing book. It has both critical and popular acclaim. She has a truly impressive following on various social media platforms. She's a former Trillium contributor, a former student of mine, a dear friend, and now my professional colleague and fellow writer. Please welcome back to Glenville State, Tara Wine Queen.
That was so nice. It's so nice to be here. I was thinking on the way over here, it's been over a decade now since I've been on the Trillium stage, and at that point I was singing and not reading.
I remember it well.
So this will be a new experience. One thing that John mentioned, I did teach for a decade, 8th grade English, which I really loved before I went to writing full time. And one thing I really miss about it is reading aloud to a captive audience. So I'm very excited to have that back now, if I could find my piece. I'm going to read two things tonight. The first one is from my book and was also published by Fiction on the Web, and it's called The Door. And then I'm going to read a creative nonfiction piece that I just finished last week. I don't know. It's very fresh. So you will get the very fresh version of it. There it is. All right. Thank you so much for being here and for listening. The Door. It would be different this time. She would get the man in the boat to open his hands so that she could read the words burned into them before they reached the waterfall, before she woke up. She closed her eyes and willed herself to sleep in the cramped hospital bed, willed herself to the wild and verdant landscape of the dream that she had been chasing all summer. She knew where it would begin. Deep within the forest, the sounds and smells of the earth and its creatures filling her senses, the air so heavy and so wet it was almost intoxicating in its oppression. Sometimes it varied in small ways, a different grove of trees or an unexpected companion. But always she would hike through the forest, following the footpath of former fellow seekers, and make her way to the boat where the man would be waiting, and always they would go together down the river. Joy? She opened her eyes in the dream and turned to see her brother standing beside of her, looking confused. He was sweating already in the heat of the forest. The moisture had patterned his t-shirt, and his brown hair was curling damp against his face. Where are we? I don't know what it's called, she said. It's some kind of rainforest. Her mind measured how much might be necessary to explain to Sydney to get him to accompany her without delay. Probably not much. Come on, we have to go meet a man. Dream Sydney followed obediently, as real-life Sydney would have. He was a good brother, loyal and soft-hearted. She led him down the path, which had already been worn the first time she stepped onto it, and they moved in companionable silence, touching when support was helpful to get through a particularly thick patch of flora, or when crossing one of the many tiny rivulets that ran between the trees. Once, he nearly fell when he tripped over a root casually breaking its way through the rich earth, but Joy grabbed him with both hands and kept him from collapse and crash, and they laughed together over his inherent clumsiness as they recovered and continued on. Joy kept them moving forward until finally she could hear the waters of the river of what she now believed to be her destiny flowing just ahead. Listen, Sid, she turned and pointed toward the sound of the rushing river. I have to go and meet this man at the river, and I have to do it alone. He won't let anyone else on the boat with him, only me. What are you getting from him? Sydney looked at her curiously, his brown eyes edging on wariness. Is it drugs, Joy? Disappointment flickered over his gaze. Have you relapsed? No, it's nothing like that, she said dismissively, painfully aware of his latent disbelief and also of his enduring love for her, which would not allow him to give up on her, which had carried her through rehab years ago. He has answers for me. He has information that I need, but I can't explain it to you now. There's not time. She looked at him kindly. You can wait here if you like. Will it be long? He sounded so like a child then. She couldn't help but pause a moment to look him over, take in how young he still was. For all his 22 years, he had never lost that bit of roundness of cheek, that glow to his skin which indicated true, unsoiled youth. It will, she admitted, and she moved toward him. Though he was taller than her by half a foot, she pulled him down into her arms and rested her head against his, forehead to damp forehead, as they had since they were children. I love you, brother. I'll be okay. She didn't say, but you won't. A different dream, and she would have luxuriated in the presence of her beloved and long-deceased little brother, would have cradled them in her arms and spun stories of their shared upbringing for hours on end, eyes feasting greedily on what had once been her favorite face. Instead, she turned from him and continued down toward the small dock made of earth and sun-bleached wood. The boat there waited patiently, the water dark and still as death around it as the rest of the river churned on. And at its front sat the man she had come to see, who had been waiting for her here throughout time. His black cotton caftan covered his body, but his sun-browned hands remained exposed and folded in his lap, the palms and pads of his fingers hidden from view. It was these hands which were the mecca of her quest. It was the black words burned into them which she required, and which hitherto he had not shared with her. She came before him and bowed deeply, her sweat-matted hair falling across her shoulders as she did so. The man rose and returned the bow, eyeing her openly the entire time. He indicated that she should sit in the same spot where she had sat dozens of times now, and she took her place beside him in the boat, determined not to fail yet again. As the boat began its journey, otherwise unmanned, but moving purposefully just the same, Joy addressed the man. You know what I seek from you. What can I offer in return? His eyes crinkled in a smile that just barely reached his lips. He liked her, she thought, but that affection had not been enough to persuade him to acquiesce to her request any of the previous times. I've told you before, he said gently. I can't tell you. It doesn't work like that. Her frustration fueled her forward to what she had determined must be the answer then. My life, then, she said simply, and met his eyes with all the dignity that she could muster. I offer it up to you or God or whatever force is orchestrating all of this in exchange for what I need. Please take it. I don't need it if she can't. Just take it if that's what's necessary. Her strongest move made, she folded her hands in her lap and waited, painfully aware of how small a thing her life must seem to a being such as this. Still, it was all she had. It was not small to her. As she had spoken, the remnants of his smile had disappeared. It was now replaced by a grievous sadness. My child, his ancient eyes searching hers, that is a noble thing which you suggest, and I grant you that is what I've needed to hear from you these many trips we've taken down the river. But now I'm afraid that I must disappoint you again, though perhaps more deeply than the previous times you've sought the cure to your daughter's disease. What? What do you mean? She blinked tears from her eyes, but seemed not to notice, her face betraying no emotion. For many nights now, he said, you have ridden along the river with me, and each night you worked to induce me to reveal to you the runes written on my hands by time itself. You have correctly inferred that to do so would change the trajectory of your life, and that of your daughter's life, and so you have longed for the revelation of these black words as single-mindedly as anyone I have ever encountered. And you're correct, Joy, that I've grown to admire you and your struggle, but you are wrong to believe that my hands contain what would heal her of her disease. Rather, the opposite. There is no timeline in which she does not come to you at 4 years old, her head aching unbearably, only discover disturbances within which the medicines of your age are incapable of touching, and which will inevitably rob you of her before she ever blossoms into a young woman. If I open my hands to you, if you look into the runes and you place your own hands in mine, you'll be born again, and these things will unfold precisely as they have in every timeline in which you exist. Only in that timeline, you'll be aware of the inescapable future you're moving toward with every breath you take. You will still become addicted to drugs. You will still meet her father in your last day in rehab. Your brother will still die mere months after your daughter had been born. In some ways, it will be unbearable, but you may bear it if you so choose, and your life and your daughter's life will change, not from the resolution of her disease, but from the fruit of your knowledge. The water had begun to roil as they came closer to the river's breaking, closer to the falls. My palms are not healing. My palms are rebirthed into a terrible but beautiful wisdom, and it's yours to choose whether you will grasp them when we arrive to the waterfall. For the laying down of your life, you've been given that choice. Joy's tears flowed freely now, tiny rivers of anguish mapping skin. You must choose now, Joy, the man said kindly, and he opened his hands to her as the waterfall pulled them to its birth. Moonlight caressed the sleeping form of her daughter, and she brushed the little girl's pale hair tenderly to the side. For the past 3 years, Joy had from time to time allowed herself to pretend that she didn't know what was waiting for them, to indulge in minutes of precious normalcy, but no more. Tonight was the last time her daughter would go to sleep again as a 3-year-old. Joy would never sleep peacefully again, anticipating the last of what she knew was coming and knew she could not stop, when the soft padding of her daughter's feet would announce her entrance into her mother's bedroom, and a complaint of a headache would be the beginning of the end. She thought often of the man in the boat, wondered who and what he had been, wondered if she would lay eyes on him ever again. But no night held within it a trip to the rainforest, a trip to the river of destiny, and she eventually gave up hope that she would see him again, at least not in this lifetime. She had never spoken of him to anyone, and if anyone else had traveled the path that she had, they never made it known to her. Still, the man in the boat had been right. The knowledge he had gifted her with was terrible, but it was beautiful as well. Because of it, she had more patience, she had grown kinder, and her relationship to gratitude had been intrinsically altered. A finite number of days were to be shared with her daughter, and as she made what peace she could with the smallness of that number, she began to grow her gratefulness for what time she did have. She played more games with her than she had before. She read her more fairy tales, took more pictures of them together and apart, let her sleep in her bed whenever she pleased, breathed in the honey doughy smell of her hair every chance she got. The giving of herself to the cause of loving her child became her new addiction. The more moments she devoted to the tiny creatures she had born, the more joy she witnessed sketched across the sweet face of her daughter, the more she desired to fill every moment of her brief life with such love. And these things, and 100 others, added up to an existence more infused with tenderness and less colored by pain, even when the rawest of pains eventually came. Her daughter had been dead for 3 years when Joy started to use again. There was only so much pain the memory of profound love and gratitude could forestall. It had begun with an altogether minor car accident, which had resulted in her receiving a mostly unnecessary prescription for pain meds. The pills alleviated pains more emotional than physical, and even habits long abandoned are easily slipped back into under a little pressure. At first, she was deeply ashamed of her dependence upon the pills, but the more she took, the less she had to feel of anything at all. The powder that came after the pills did more than alleviate the pain. It allowed her to swim in the warm waters of pleasurable nothingness. It was in the course of one of these swims that she found herself floundering in a great river, the waters pouring over her head and pushing her downward again and again. She was drowning, she realized numbly, and she had just begun to surrender to it when she felt hands, sun-browned hands, which burned the skin they touched, pull her roughly out of the water and onto a wooden craft. It took a few minutes to rid herself of the water, to gather her wits in sight. When finally she did, she saw it was as it had seemed. She was once more on the boat of her long-ago dreams, and the burning hands which had pulled her back out of the waters were those of the man in the black caftan. She wondered vaguely if he still held any affection for her. "Hello, Joy," he said quietly. "It's been a long time." She didn't know how to respond, so she just sat quietly waiting for his disappointment. All of the beauty and terror of the knowledge he had given to her the last time had sustained her through the life and death of her daughter, but still she had succumbed to her basest instincts, her ugliest truth. Whatever he had seen in her before that had caused his smile to reach his eyes had been long lost, and she wished that he had simply left her drowning in the river instead of pulling her out and exposing her to this judgment. She had thought there was no one left in life to disappoint. "Joy," he said softly, "we are heading for the waterfall again. The last time that you were heading toward it, you were searching for answers, and while I ultimately gave you what was mine to give in exchange for your willingness to give up your own life, I understand it wasn't what you wanted, and that it brought you great pain too. I also know that through that knowledge you grew in empathy. You became the best version of yourself while your daughter lived, and your weaknesses fell away for a time. Because they have risen to the top in the aftermath of her death, you now feel ashamed of me in front of me. Is this correct?" Joy nodded once, not yet braving eye contact. "I want you to listen to me now," he said, "to really listen. What you have gone through in your relatively short lifetime has plumbed the darkest depths of human experience. People weren't crafted to make it through the sort of things you have unscathed. What you see as an inexcusable recurrence may seem unforgivable to yourself, but it is not so to me. The tenderness with which you raised your daughter the years that you had her was miraculous, Joy. She was so very loved, and she knew it. Do you know how rare that is? That is invaluable. That is all that is of value in the end. Your weaknesses, which may seem an impenetrable prison right now, are in truth nothing more than a room with a door that you may open and let yourself out of at any time." At this, Joy raised her face to him. "You and I are going to go over the waterfall again, Joy. I'm going to open my hands to you, and this time, when you grab them, the knowledge you'll be given is self-knowledge. You will know your own goodness, as I have known it, and you will forgive yourself as your daughter who knew nothing but love from you would. We will open the door together, okay?" He raised his palms to her, the black runes burned to them, beckoning to her in the sunlight with the promise of redemption, and the waterfall came into view. She stared out over it, into the horizon which sprawled out before her, a universe of possibility unfurling in its unyielding beauty and complexity. Joy looked back at him, eyes aching with hope, and with one swift movement, she took his hands in hers. "Yes, okay." His hands burned hers, and she held them even tighter. "Yes, please." And over the falls they went together, hand in forgivable hand. Okay, now this one that was fiction, obviously. This is creative nonfiction. It's an essay about my husband, who is my favorite person, so I'm really thrilled to read it. It's called On Safety. For many years, the place that I felt safest was the nameless third space of the internet, the airwaves where you and I alone existed. After years of bashful elementary interludes and even more awkward preteen ones, we received access to the greatest gift of our generation's youth, AOL Instant Messenger. I don't know if like you young people don't know what that is. I'm sorry, but it's just like Messenger. It's like any kind of messenger, but it was the first one. It was a big deal. We never had that before. It's awesome. Okay, sorry. No longer did I have to worry about words not coming out of my mouth quite right. No longer did I have to stress about whether I had remembered to put deodorant on my ripening body, or if I looked fat in the shirt I was wearing because it had horizontal stripes instead of the more flattering vertical ones, or if you noticed that one tooth is slightly gummier than the rest. On AIM, I could give you the best of me without all those things that made me feel lesser than, clever behind a keyboard in ways I never could have imagined in person. Without the constraints of others' expectations or the limitations of our bodies, we explored who we were and who we wanted to become. No walls contained us, only the quiet gray lines of the text box that we poured our hope into. Boodle-doop, that was the sound it would make when someone messaged you, is the sound of our salvation. We wait for it to play out from our computer speakers in our separate rooms in our tiny West Virginia town, you in your house and me in mine. Sometimes I spend the night at Lindsay's, and these times are better. At home, the computer is in my parents' room, and we can't stay up talking all night. But at Lindsay's is in the dining room, and I can use it as long and as much as I like, every possible minute filled with you. In person, we can't quite figure out how to navigate around the pedestals that we've kept each other on for so long. In person, we struggle to meet each other's eyes, though I do catch you trying to look down my shirt in science class once, and the horrified deer in the headlights eye contact you threw my way upon getting caught is carved into my memory for life. But the moment the sound of a door opening plays across the speakers and we are reunited over chat, all of that dissipates, and we transform into our purest, most curious selves. Our secrets passed over the ether to the other, who drinks them all in, an aching, desperate thirst for intimacy quenched. We are in love at 17. We have never said it. We don't know the truth of how the other feels, afraid to reveal something so deeply rooted in ourselves and discover it unechoed in the other. We date everyone else. Sometimes when we date other people, we stop talking to the other, aware on some subconscious level that anytime we are in a room together and not touching, we're lying. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes we interweave those people into our lives, present them like gifts we've brought the other, a new friend to play with. You two have so much in common. You'll love him. She reminds me of you. And always, when it ends, we come back to that shared space where we feel most at home, even when we are far apart. Once, in a moment of frankness I usually don't exhibit outside of our conversations, I tell everyone, you're my number one priority, even my prickly boyfriend who you are in a band with. You guys get into it, but then get over it in that weird way that boys can, punching one moment and then playing video games the next. He will be my first husband after he gets me pregnant when I'm 18. You will take the pictures at the wedding years later, a last-ditch attempt to make the pairing stick, and your first wife will be one of my bridesmaids. You'll get drunker than I had ever seen you, your face red like you'd spent too long in the sun, though I'd never seen you burn. It was the worst day of my life, you'll tell me later, your finger tracing the lines of my face. But I never had to ask you to smile for the camera. You always smiled whenever you looked at me. As we age, so does the software that sheltered us those precious years. AIM falls away, other mediums sprout up to transport us again to that secret space separate from the world and all its expectations. In the second half of our 20s, I am married, barely. You no longer are. When my union finally crumbles, it's a surprise to no one. It was in pieces before it ever began. For what it's worth, I loved you, my first husband says, taking a drag off a cigarette when he's standing in the door to leave. Find somebody better, man. You are waiting in that nameless third space where we both exist in our purest forms and don't exist at all. It happens in slow motion. It happens in an avalanche. You check up on me each morning, on every break, when you get off work, before you fall asleep at night. You change the locks on my house and make me playlists, one for when I want to be sad, and one to remind me that there are better days yet to come. I can see you now so clearly, and I can see you seeing me, and I'm no longer afraid to be seen. In fact, I want it more than life. Who am I gonna make out with now? I whined to you over text one night, opening a door that you can walk through if you like. I will make out with you anytime, you say with astonishing ease, and carry our secret space out into the light where it can have life breathed into it for the first time. At first, I'm scared that you love me now, when I have loved you always. Somehow that seems too much to bear. But it's not the case, and we retrace the steps that we have taken together and apart. The dancing we've done throughout the years around these secret pedestals we kept the other on. Not quite so secret, though. Our wedding book is full of notes from our friends saying, everyone knew, except you absent. Finally, it's about goddamn time. Always, I thought that our shared space was without boundaries, that it was there that we were freest. It's only outside of it that I can see now how it confined us as it cradled us, how it restricted us, even as it was our refuge. We delight in each other's separate memories of what we believe to be unrequited love. We weep over the thousands of days that we went without walking side by side, the best of us hidden away from the light that it could have blossomed beneath. You write me poetry, and I cut off all your hair. We are beginning anew, born into the tangible versions of ourselves that we had once dreamed of in our youth. And the days are slow and sweet. Everything drips like honey from our fingers. Yay! Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Should I sit? Can I sit? Is that good?
You can sit.
Well,
You
thank you
earned it.
so much.
Tara, thank you so much. My goodness. I'm your fan. I think you just have a room full of new fans after that reading. Am I right about that? Yeah, that was amazing. You have such a poetic quality to your writing. My goodness, you're a poet at heart. I'm convinced of it. Yeah, no, I think it's there. I think it's there. Thank you so much. That was amazing. But wait, there's more. We have some contributors to the Trillium, the new Trillium, which, by the way, I don't know if I said this, but they're right back there, so please don't leave without a copy of it. And if you want to go ahead and get one and read along with the contributors who are going to read their work from it, feel free to pop up and get one. Or have John grab one for you there. So our first contributor on the schedule is also GSU's current Poetry Slam champion. Please welcome, right there, Jordan Pearson. Jordan, come on up here.
First and foremost, I would be remiss not to use my brief access to this platform to ask that we as a community listen to the autistic community and their families and not donate or use the symbolism of Autism Speaks, which the community has been very critical of. Thank you. This piece is called Myriad. Bursting forth into the cold expanse, into sublime absence, beyond the soil's claim, she calls your name. Echoed in rushing floods, imminent flushing, blood breaches and buds, fingers dig into mud, and it does the same. But she calls your name. From the banks of a distant Eden, she insistently sings in foreign tongues the language of the other side, transcribed from the distant dreams of your youth, where she called you. And you answered. And you could see the truth, the other side bore fruit. That fruit is long since gone. But she calls.
Thank you, Jordan. That's amazing. Are you guys glad you're here? Yeah. I'm glad I'm here. This is what it's all about. All right, our next contributor on the schedule is a veteran of these Trillium readings. You're in for a treat. Please welcome Christopher Chambers.
So I've got a few works. Two of them are smaller and lighter. The other's a tragedy. It's okay. But I'm going to start with the first one because I got to move in the first place. It's called Move Deftly. You're learning to make a fire. Move deftly. The dreams do not conceive themselves. Move wisely. We'll never liberate the lonely shelves of knowledge never touched. The fire is abandoned. A blaze that burns out, wild and never managed. Above all that, move. For no one will move for you. You are alone in your heart. There is no delegating the chambers and their delicate art. You are the only mover to motivate yourself to stretch the bounds and touch the great, the wonderful things embedded in your soul. You are the greatest friend you could ever cajole. Create a self. Make a move. For the dreams do not conceive themselves. Books and art nor decorations, until you liberate those lonely shelves. Learn all you can. Live your life all you can. Move deftly. I didn't know about that first piece, reading it out loud. It was something I was like, why did she pick that? The 8 billion things I submitted.
Wasn't quite 8 billion.
Yeah, I was like
8 million.
30 something. But this next one's called Enemy, times 2. Enemy, enemy, how you've made a friend of me. Your scowl holds many a charm, so much that I fear no harm. Enemy, mine enemy, you stumble in your way, satisfaction you will give me if you stop at that this day. You owe no man nothing, so please stop paying them grief and give yourself something better than those that you owe receive. Give yourself love, for you have been hurt and you feel the need to follow suit. And you need to be attended to, cared for, and assured that no one else can fill your shoes. Enemy, dear enemy, let's forget the term. I know I haven't the energy to let myself burn on both ends of hatred and pain. That way we never see the sun again. There's simply no time to be bitter. Life is too short. And this last one's called Cinderella. I really like this one. So this one is decorated in 2 voices. I wish she would have kept the italics when she wrote this down, because I had an italicized voice, and then I had a voice that was in a regular font. But here we go. This is Cinderella. Oh, mystical mirror of fantastic woe, what on this day do you have to show? Oh, poet, not this game again. Why do you obsess over unhappy ends? Is your mystical tongue getting rusty? For a rhyme like that, you would have cussed me. I suppose in that I could agree, but the shrill of your voice is agony. Ouch, that hurt my stony heart. So shall we skip to the storytelling part? A story you want, you get your wish. It's not my fault for regret of this. Oh, what Cinderella would give to escape the wretched life she lived, so callous, gray, blistered. To live a wretched life with wretched sisters. She wasn't really of this home, despite it being the only place she'd known. She now solely knew harshness and hurt, and only of lies within kind words. Constantly thinking, why couldn't the world be kind like her father? Taking the steps to be human, no shorter, no farther. The world was an enemy to this once pure, innocent heart. A vessel of goodness that the prince would tear apart. But that is an end to a beautiful girl. Let us not be hasty in marring this pearl. Or what Cinderella would give to escape the wretched life she lived, a farmhand, a slave, as well as a hated sister and daughter. Thinking on these things, she went for the pig needing slaughter. She carried the knife with a heavy hand. If she didn't do it, they'd liberate her hand. Fate would have it, and fate be damned. A horse fled the barn and jumped the bounds, scrammed. Through the forest of thorns she ambled. The pain of each one was hard to handle. She lay helpless as she fell to the floor of the forest she hadn't wandered before. When a wish for help was uttered so quietly, the pain of the thorns stopped its riding. As a fairy of the woods, nymph-like appeared, smiling tenderly and lending her an ear. Oh fairy, I don't want this life. A slave and a peasant asking why I'm alive. I don't want to live in this wretched squalor. I miss when people were kind like father. So the fairy heard her, and the fairy did say, what if I told you a prince could take all these lonely pains away? Is such a thing on earth that sweet? Could a life like that be for me? I give you these slippers in the time of this day. I give you this carriage. Don't waste this away. When midnight strikes, you will lose this. Beware what you leave and who the slipper fits. From the fairy she took the glass, and onto her feet the slippers passed. Her rags to silk, her hair to braids. She was a beauty more radiant than the day. Unto the carriage to visit the prince, to dawn new life, she had asked for this. Unto the court she had charmed her way. She put the poor groundskeeper in a daze. To dawn new life she had asked for this. And she had now come unto the lucky prince. Regal and elegant in all manners, doused in white to match the royal banner, his smile held the world. How vibrant did Cinderella shine like a pearl. prince held his eyes on her likeness and promptly addressed her as your highness. And all the youth and wooing and talking, the clock was tick, tick, talking. When a kiss had become the object of direction, the clock had interrupted their affection. Midnight tolled the grievous, joyous bell, while Cinderella bounded like a gazelle away from the prince, so he didn't see the rags she would return to, torn and bloodied. Much to her misfortune, as the fairy had warned, she let her slipper fall in a thicket of thorns. Oh, how grievous did that rosy, thorny thicket ring. How grievous did that thorny thicket ring. When the prince found the glass, he had scoured the land for a princess that he had wanted at hand, a princess who he'd barely come to understand. Cinderella wept long the weeks that it took, for the stepsisters waited for him to look their way. To her dismay, they cut her hair, forced her to wear always the tattered, bloodied rags that she had dragged back from the thorn forest. Why must life be so torturous? When the prince had come her way, he did not even know her face. He didn't recognize her, which could only mean agonize her. And the slipper was not used on her. Why would the prince look for a princess among the poor that serve? And out the candle of hope went when the glass slipper fit the foot of her cruel stepsister. Out, brief candle, through the thorn forest Cinderella ambled, seeing the fairy's carriage and vision deluded. A hoof broke the distance, and the skull that had viewed it.
Thank you, Christopher. I always tell my creative writing students, don't start out by rhyming. It's really hard to do. It's going to sound wooden and clunky, and you're going to mess it up. Chris, you make it seem so effortless, so easy. That was amazing. All right, our next reader, I think, is appearing for the first time in the Trillium. She's right there. Michaela Hooter, come on up.
So this is called The Giver. You give so much and expect nothing in return. She responds with a smile and slightly turns. That turn is a switch and the memories start rolling, the times that she was simply asking for holding. Instead, she got through problems and learned to put herself second, third, fourth. And when you say she is a giver, you aren't telling her what she doesn't already know. Instead, you are reminding her of those times that she was told no. She learned from a young age to put others before herself. Some might say it was a survival technique. Others say it's a trauma response. She simply says who she is. She is me.
Thank you, Michaela. Let's don't make this the only time that you're in the Trillium. How about that? Okay, good deal. We have such talented students at GSU. We really do. Our next performer, reader, Veronica Roos. Did I say that right? I always get it wrong. Now it's in my head. Now it's just going to be a thing. Veronica, let me brag a little bit. Veronica, along with Jordan, performed in our murder mystery dinner theater very recently, along with, of course, John Chambers there, and Sam Chambers, who...
Johnson!
I'm related.
It was so much fun. They did such a good job. We have a very talented campus with just the best, most talented students. Veronica, come on up here.
So mine is prose. It's Nettles to Feathers, and it's based on a fairy tale called The Six Swans. Sometimes it's 7, sometimes it's 12. Either way, the mom who gave birth to them was probably not very happy. Once upon a time, a young queen, her son, and 7 brothers were traveling back to her husband. Her youngest brother had been born with a swan wing, and they had just spent some months looking for a way to fix it. In her country, they had asked every magic user to no avail and thought that there could be answers in another country. They were wrong. Her husband met them at the gates. His face was grim. Nuala, the priests have heard that you've been consorting with witches. The people have risen against you. I am sorry, but we must spirit you and your brothers away in a dramatic fashion, in a way that will make the people believe that you have been punished. Nuala's face twisted in grief. She hadn't loved her husband, not as he did her, but she respected him and knew him well. Already, she knew that he would ask that she left her son with him. He was, after all, the only heir, and the nation's religion dictated that you mustn't marry until all your current children were adults. But she nodded anyway. She was a queen. She knew how to sacrifice family. Looking down at her child's screaming face, for he had awoken and could tell something was wrong, she still wished she had more time. She looked to the king in his eyes and made him swear that the child would just happen to visit his grandfather in 10 years, after fears were forgotten, and he would visit every year during the summer from then on. Nodding, he kissed her cheek and she kissed her son's, and he took the child to place in the arms of his own mother, who smiled wickedly. She had never liked Nuala, and had possessively doted on the child, spoiling him rotten and teaching him bad habits. The king led Nuala to a pyre, and the people cheered at the thought of the foreign witch burning. But before the eager citizens could toss a torch, Nuala's brothers surrounded the fire and begged the people to pity the woman. This was where the king was supposed to fake a holy possession. He was a god in human body, after all. He knew how to roll his eyes back, and nobody alive had seen a possession. The last one had been over a century back. He was supposed to grant them absolution and banish them from the nation, for it was the least the people would accept. But when he turned to face his wife, there was no compassion in those glowing ruby eyes. A sneer so unlikely to be found on the man's face curled at his lips, and his voice seemed to boom across the city square. He seemed to stare at her youngest brother's wing, and his sneer grew worse. This witch deserves far more suffering than death, as do her brothers. Shadows extended from his fingertips and curled around the terrified men, wrapping tighter and tighter around their bodies until they were just shrinking voids, and the god smiled triumphantly. They shall be turned into white swans, and unless she follows my rules 3, they will stay in these forms forever. Firstly, she must pluck every feather from their wings, which in turn will become a nettle. Secondly, she must plant each into the ground, and they will stay as swans. Finally, if so much as a single sound escapes her lips between then and now, they will die. The king fell to his knees like a marionette whose strings had been cut, and the shadows dissipated, leaving 7 swans surrounding the young queen. Making eye contact, the king mouthed a single word: "Run." The swans snatched up bits of the rope that had been wrapped around Nuala's body, and flew off with her in tow, a screaming horde chasing after the bevy until well after sunset. It cut off all of her circulation most uncomfortably, but Nuala couldn't protest. She couldn't even sigh, and as her brothers landed in the pond far off, she couldn't even scream as she nearly drowned, wrapped in the sodden rope. When she finally broke the surface of the water, trying to quietly swallow down the water in her lungs instead of coughing, she looked at her brother's eyes and saw nothing there. Nuala was alone. She was far away from her father. Her son would grow up not knowing her, and she couldn't even talk to her brothers. She wept, but did not sob, and climbed a tree. It was unsafe this near the forest. The boars may try to get her when she slept. They would not bother her brothers. After a month of setting herself up with food and weaving, Nuala managed to catch one of her brothers and carefully tucked one of his feathers, turned nettles, into a basket she had made. He scratched his hit, with wings strong enough to break a man's thigh, and she bruised most terribly. But with each feather she picked, a black one appeared, so she only hoped the god had told the truth. She managed to catch them all during the first spring, and spent the summer, when she wasn't dying of heat exhaustion or fending off the animals of the forest, sewing and tending to the nettles, her fingers dark with dirt and calluses covering the front and back of her hands. It was nearing the middle of September when it occurred to the woman that swans flew away during the winter. She eyed her brothers. Would they leave? Would they come back? Would she be done by the time they came back? Should she lock them up? Then the fall equinox happened. When she awoke at sunrise, her brothers were turning human, and they whooped for joy when they saw her in an empty basket next to a field of young nettles. "Nuala, you have cured us!" They quieted when they realized there was more baskets. Quickly, using some improvised sign language, they remembered that the equinoxes were considered unholy days, and that the gods had no power during those days. They spent the day enjoying their humanity, but as the moon rose, shadows seemed to once again cover the men, and they were thoughtless beasts who flew away the next day. Nwala allowed herself to cry again and wonder about her son. She sewed half another basket of nettles, but soon had to give it up to prepare for the winter. She wove herself a structure in the trees just before the frost hit. Covering her face, she would go into the local town to trade baskets for blankets, but it wasn't enough to completely stave off the cold. Her bones felt like ice, and it was a wonder she didn't get frostbite. She swore that she would put the boys to work next time they were human, to make her a house for next winter. She couldn't afford to hire anyone. The day before the spring equinox, the black swans returned, and the next sunrise they were put to work. Nwala could tell they wanted to complain, but then they'd look at her hands and shut up. And looking at the skies, they could tell it was going to snow. Nwala managed to do 2 more baskets of nettles when the village nearby started noticing the nettles creeping out from the woods, and how, whenever she walked into the markets, she had hundreds of scratches covering her. The word witch started to be thrown around again. One man, who had been in the capital when the curse was laid upon her family, said she looked an awful lot like the queen. Stares drilled into the back of her head as she left the market. As she walked back to her field, she knew she was being watched. She had a week before the next equinox. The people may react on the equinox, if the lack of holy magic showed them that yes, she was the queen. So during that time, she packed all her things, knocked her shelter off the branches, and set it ablaze in the middle of the pond as to leave no trace of her life there. She mourned the loss of it, for winter was coming again, but she knew where she had to go. When the equinox came, she quickly wrote in the dirt what was happening and what her plan was, and so she and her brothers ran nearly the whole day. When sunset came, she tied their feet to her lightest blanket, and they flew her to an island in the middle of the sea. It was a small island, and she was able to plant another half a basket of nettle there before the next equinox. Thankfully, they took to the soil quickly and did not require much tending, but still she suffered. This winter, she only had 1 blanket, and no one to trade for it for more food. Fresh water had to be used sparingly, and the only shelter she could make was a sandy hole dug in the ground, covered by her rotting and frozen blanket. In the days where the only thing she could do to survive was stay in that hole, she allowed herself to think of her son. Was he writing yet? Would he draw a picture of his family, and would she be in it? Or would he only draw his father and grandmother? When March came, her brothers spent the whole day sewing together the scraps of their clothing and what bits of the blanket that hadn't rotted, so once again they could fly across the sea. They barely made it to the beaches of their home country when the blanket ripped, and Nwala fell in. Drenched and miserable, she built a fire out of the driftwood and friction, and watched her brothers glide in the waves. Sadly, she restocked to stay at the beach, so as not to lose her brothers, and set about making herself shelter. The wind whipped around her all day, every day, and on one especially cruel April day, she lost 3 nettle feathers. She spent the whole of May looking for them, barely sleeping or eating, terrified of the prospect of never finishing. When she finally found her last one, caught under a bit of seaweed, she nearly sobbed in relief, only to catch herself at the last moment. The nettles didn't do very well on the sands of that beach, and so she was only able to finish her 5th basket, whereas she could have finished 2 in that time before. When the fall equinox hit, the brothers only looked at her sadly. They all gathered up some seashells and walked as far inland as they could, and stopped once they reached a decently sized town. Nwala sold the shells and saved up enough to buy some more blankets and a room in the inn occasionally, on the worst nights. Sometimes she worked as a barmaid and wondered how many people would recognize her as the king of this land's daughter if she wasn't so dirty and scratched up all the time. Finally, she found the time and the money to send word to her father about the situation. She signed it, "Your least favorite daughter, Nwala," so he would know it was her. Only she and her father knew of the joke, and she wanted to make sure that she was alive and not an imposter. The rumors about her had greatly exaggerated her death. Her father managed to get a fast carriage in town in time for the spring equinox, and Nwala and her brothers managed to get back to the castle in style. They arrived just as the sun finished setting. As soon as all the courtiers and other gawkers had left, Nwala threw her arms around over her father's and embraced him tightly. It had been over 5 years since she had last seen him. Looking over her scarred and bent form and at the Swan brothers, the king promised, "It will be done, soon." Nuala and her brothers, who were now kept captive so they wouldn't be confused about the change of location, were sent to live in the summer lodge, where there was only good soil and space for planting. With only half of the basket left, Nuala, her father, and her brothers spent the days relaxing and enjoying themselves, excitement for what was soon to come racing through their minds. By October 31st, she had planted all of the feathers, and when she returned to the castle that evening, her heart racing with joy at the thought of finally being free of the curse, she nearly tripped over her feet when she saw her brothers still swans, swimming in the castle baths. With horror, she thought back to the god's words. There hadn't been a promise of actually turning the brothers back, just the possibility. Full of impotent rage, Nuala struck the ground. She had given up her voice for this, her freedom for this, her child, who would now be 5, with 3.5 years without a mother, for this. During that winter, she would barely eat or sleep, drifting silently throughout the castle, her burning sorrow striking a melancholic feeling into the heart of whoever saw her. The king could bear it no longer. On the spring equinox, when the enemy gods were weak but his gods were strong, the king went deep into the forest. He got lost. He found what was seemingly a humble little cottage and prostrated himself on the front step. Eventually, the door swung open. The goddess, whose eyes were like green shadows, looked down upon the king. "I know what it is you seek," the goddess told him, "but what will you give in return?" That moonrise, the king didn't return, or rather, only part of him did. The goddess held the still beating heart of the king as she walked between the bent forms of the brothers and Nuala, the sun setting fast behind her. She smeared a bit of blood on each man's forehead and shrunk and placed the heart on the tongue of Nuala. She then said a blessing, unknowable to mortal ears. The brothers glowed. Nuala screamed. The goddess disappeared. The next day, Nuala was crowned queen. And years later, her daughter, for her child was actually a daughter, visited. And they were so happy. The end.
Thank you so much, Veronica. I hope you guys have enjoyed our readers as much as I have. You've been a really good audience. Now, it's something of a Trillium tradition to have an open mic. So, audience, if you want to keep this show going just a little bit longer, we can with an open mic. If there's anybody here that wants to read something, or if you have a request from the Trillium. We do have another contributor there in the audience, and so audience, if you would like to hear Kylie read for a little bit, let me know and let her know by applauding for her as she makes her way up here.
I have a little fiction piece called Striped Violence. Buckle up. Xander drove to the college up the windy roads. He disliked these roads so much because of the twisty turns and unexpected potholes. His little speed demon car has hit many medium-sized animals. One common animal around Glenville that is often hit is raccoons. Those annoying critters like to pop out of nowhere and cause people to panic. Xander had to slow down numerous times that night because of these raccoons. He misses them majority of the time, but he has hit a few. Those few raccoons that he had hit have caused some significant damage under the car. These raccoons are also a decent size. If raccoons eat well, they can be the size of a dinner table seat. The car's undercarriage does not look too hot, but nothing has fallen out of place right just yet. Xander had to stay late tonight at the college to finish some last-minute assignments. He did not like to stay out too late because the animals on the road late at night are unpredictable, but Xander was driving home. He knew something was going to happen. When he saw the raccoon, he pulled over and stared. It was not moving. Xander got out of his truck, grabbed the baseball bat, and hit it. Whack! He grabbed the raccoon by the neck and dragged it behind the truck and threw it in the ditch. He then ran back to the truck, climbed in. His pulse was racing, breathing shallow, and then turned on his hazards. The raccoon looked up at him, then slowly collapsed into the muddy ditch. It has been a few days since that crazy incident. Xander had no clue what came over him. He just wanted the raccoon gone. He was so sick of him. The animal was clearly dumb enough to lay in the middle of the road and do nothing. It seemed like the raccoon was not trying anymore. Xander thought he had to do it a favor by putting out of its misery. Xander was able to leave the college early that evening. He was so glad that he finished up his work on time. Xander now has free time to himself. He was on the road that led to his house. While scanning the road ahead, a raccoon crouched under the guardrail. He paid no mind and kept going. And then he saw a few more upon the right of the hillside, gathered up as a group. They sat under some overhanging rocks. He tried to gather his wits. Xander had never seen this many raccoons all at once. As he continued to drive, he saw more raccoons along the guardrail. The raccoons sat above and below the barrier, while others were on the hillside in the left lane of the road. They were like ants. These raccoons were literally everywhere. Ugh, why is there so many of you? His road rage had peaked. Xander started swerving around the road, trying to hit the raccoons. For some reason, he has not been able to hit a single one. All the raccoons had super speed of some sort, or Xander was just tripping out. Xander's grin grew wide as he saw a raccoon sitting to the right on the end of the lane, not moving. He took his time to take a sharp turn. Screech! His tires came to a screeching halt as he crashed into the guardrail. The front of the truck is crushed like a tin can. All the windows now rest all over him and on the ground. Xander's ears rung as his blurry vision tries to regain itself. The raccoons have gathered around his truck. They rest at the windows and even on the inside. As Xander began to understand shapes, he saw many gray blurs around him. He heard the chattering of the raccoons and he jumped. He regained his vision. He was mortified by the overwhelming number of raccoons around him. Xander could feel his heart racing. All at once, they got onto Xander and ravaged his body. Xander screamed loudly as he felt sharp teeth bite into his flesh as if it were cheese. As his helpless screams echoed amongst the hills, the raccoons had a feast. All that were left were shredded up clothes and a mostly eaten human.
A work of fiction, but maybe a cautionary tale. Route 33 gets pretty wild at night, I'm telling you. You've been a terrific audience. Thank you so much. Let's please give Tara Wine Queen another round of applause for being here with us. That was amazing. And our contributors as well. Thank you so much. You've been a great audience. If you want to stick around and have a snack, we have snacks. You can say hello to Tara before she heads back to Weston. And thank you all again.